In this tutorial we'll look at the parameters editor, which is the lower third of the screen below the visual editor. As you'll remember, we get to that by double clicking any entity on the timeline, and if we're on a dual GUI, the visual editor will appear on the right hand side. I've just got 3 random effects on this timeline at the moment. This stack doesn't actually make any sense, but it will give us a better tour of the types of parameters we're going to encounter. So I'll double click on solid. Solid, by the way, is just a method of generating a color field. So by default it's black, but in this tutorial we're generally interested in everything below this light grey line, so this lower third here, with the exception of just some of these buttons which we'll go into shortly. The lower third area of the visual editor is where we actually interact with our effects and give them values and parameters and animation and so on. Some effects have their own dedicated overlay. We've seen the color corrector already, and this overlay is for the solid effect because it's a color generator, so obviously it has the gadgets that you'd expect to be able to generate a color. But these overlays are actually just a human interface to a set of parameters, and those parameters can be charted on a graph for animation. Many effects don't need their own overlays. You'd simply control them through the graph and the parameters, so that's what we'll look at now. To look behind an overlay, simply press the curves button here, and it'll drop back to the parameter graph. Likewise, clicking curves again will get you back to the interface that's dedicated to that effect. So starting down here, the parameters editor is tab-based, like the dashboard, and each tab has its own set of functions. So there's edit, clipboard, folders, propagate, math, and setup, which we'll look at independently. Going down to this area, this is where all the parameters of the effects can be set and interacted with. The way the interface works is parameters are set into groups or folders. In this case there's a folder called solid. The arrow on the end allows you to open that group of parameters. As you can see, as soon as I open the parameters, not only do they appear here, they also all appear on the graph. Some effects have multiple folders. For example, if I went up to the blur that I put on the timeline, we can see that there are 2 subfolders inside a folder here, and that's what this minus is for. I can hide all the subfolders. The plus tells me that there are subfolders in this group. Here I can look at just the parameters that are part of the modes group or the radius group, or you can have them all on together. Some effects have more than others, obviously, and I've set up a Comet 3D here in which I've put in a number of layers. So in this instance it actually goes off the bottom of the screen. So to scroll up and down, simply use the upper rocker on the pen or the right button on the mouse to drag around, the same way that you drag around the canvas up here. Sometimes you might open so many parameters that they don't fit on the screen either, in which case again the right button or the upper rocker will allow you to drag up and down. Note that there's almost an invisible divide here, because when I drag up and down here I'm moving the parameter groups list, whereas over here I'm dragging the parameters themselves. That may not be immediately obvious when you're looking at an interface like this, and you might wonder why that isn't moving anywhere. The idea of the folders is to be able to simplify the interface. So for example here, where I pulled out 50 or so parameters all in one go, actually I generally wouldn't work like that because that's just too many things to look at. I would just open this and open just specifically the things that I want to look at. So let's go back to something simpler. So just going back to the color field where we just had those sets of parameters. Let's look at how we interact with these parameters. There are 2 types of parameters that you might come across. There are numeric ones and there are option ones. The option ones are simply selectable items, and just as we saw on the visual editor interface, by pressing the lower rocker or the middle mouse button we can toggle through them. Numeric values can be set by clicking on them and typing. They can also be set by pressing the keyboard up and down, in which case the up and down arrows will go a unit at a time. If you hold down Alt, they'll go 0.1 of a unit at a time. Control will give you 100 units at a time. this parameter limits at 100, which is why it jumped from 30 to 100. Shift will allow you to jump 10 at a time. You can also drag the values. So clicking or tapping down on a value and dragging up and down will allow you to change the value. And likewise, holding down Alt while you drag will make a finer change, or Shift 10 times the change, or Control 100 times the change. You can copy parameters and curves between each other. For example, select the red curve, Control C, go to the green curve, Control V. If you want to change two parameters together, holding down Shift to multiply select parameters, and now drag them not with the left button or tapping down on the pen, but rather the middle button or the lower rocker of the pen, and the two will go together. Moving to our graph, we can see that changing parameters on here is always changing the value for that parameter on the graph itself. The graph can be scaled using these items here. So the top two are click and drags, whereas there's zoom reset to its defaults. There's also zoom fit. Zoom fit will scale the graph to fit whatever items you have selected. So if I selected that entire folder and press zoom fit, the scale of the graph is now changed so that all of my parameters can be seen. Selecting given parameters will select their corresponding parameter on the graph, being the blue line. Conversely, double-clicking a point on the graph will select the corresponding parameter. We can also make changes to parameters by interacting with the graph itself, so to grab a point and drag up and down. Apart from hiding entire groups from the graph, you can also hide individual items. For example, here we can see that red and green are sitting on top of each other. So if I were to grab this and move it, I wouldn't necessarily know which one I'm going to move. But simply by pressing H for hide, we can see that the red item has now been removed from the graph. Just to prove it, there's the green one as well. So now I know that with only the green one visible, I can grab just the green and reveal the red with Shift H. Remember that in most cases to reverse a function is simply the shift of the shortcut key. We have two methods of deciding what frame we're looking at. We have a scroll bar here and here, they're both linked. This is just more immediate for working directly with the graph. You can also see from the highlighted areas that the top scroll bar ends on the last frame of the clip that we've got selected, whereas the graph has an extra frame. This allows you to place a keyframe effectively on the first frame of the incoming shot, and one of the benefits of this is to make sure an animation continues right through to the second field of your last frame. We'll look at the function of auto key. At the moment it's off, and that's its default setting. Auto key, as you might expect, is for inserting keyframes automatically to create animation. With it off, the default behavior is this. Notice that my playhead here is on frame 14, but if I start making value changes to the parameter, it's actually changing the first frame. In other words, with auto key off, it's not creating any new animation. On the other hand, if I put auto key on, I can now animate my effect. And as we can see, we're now generating a color change between those settings. If we have an animation in place and switch off auto key, its default behavior now will be to simply offset the entire animation. On the other hand, having auto key on will always generate a new keyframe. Earlier we did a copy and paste between parameters. In fact, that copy and paste operation, Control C, and say to the blue channel, Control V, will in fact copy the entire curve. So you can now see the blue is sitting on top. And if we turned auto key off, we could offset the entire blue curve. We can delete keys by just selecting them and pressing the delete button. Of course, we can do multiple points if we lasso them. If we have a selection and press delete, it will restore the whole curve to its default setting. In this particular instance, it's 0. At this time, it's probably also worth looking at what happens on the timeline with animated curves. So I'm just going to go back. I'm just going to delete all of those and just start again with a fresh solid from the effects menu here. So you can see at first instance, this solid has no icons on it. As soon as I make a change to something, the little star tells me that the parameters are not in their default positions. Something has changed. If we have an animated curve on one of our effects, say for example something like this, then as we edit in the timeline, there are two methods to control the animation. As you can see at the moment, my animation runs from frame 0 to 25. You may recall from the quick start guides that we can trim clips and effects by scrolling along the clip with the right mouse button or the upper rocker, and then as we get to the end, joining it, so we press two buttons at the same time with the pen tapping down or with the mouse left button, and we can extend the clip. So having now extended this clip, what's happened to the animation? Well, if I double click, we can see that in fact my animation has scaled. So it's effectively done a fit to fill between the old length and the new length. Now there are some occasions where we wouldn't want that to happen. For example, if this keyframe was specifically related to frame 24, we didn't want to change that, like in tracking or stabilizing or something. In which case, so using the same behavior to trim this clip, but this time before we press the second button, hold down Alt as well on the keyboard. So on the timeline it appears everything is the same, but when I go back to the curve, we can see that actually frame 24, the keyframe is still there, and the animation is allowed to go off the end of the clip. So that means that frame by frame, all these parameters are exactly the same. So the difference is simply that when you're trimming the clip, whether or not you're holding down Alt.